Support for WUWM podcasts comes from Hop Harvest and Vine and Good Harvest Market in Pewaukee, part of One Destination, combining farm-to-table dining, local craft beers, and organic groceries under one roof. More at goodharvestmarket.com.
From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Today, we'll learn about the different philosophies for interpreting our state's constitution and why it's important to understand ahead of the April election. Then we'll speak with the co-founder of Renaissance Theaterworks, who's retiring after more than 30 years of artistic leadership.
I feel most proud that we've stayed true to our mission. And the thing that's the most important about Renaissance are the people.
Plus, a new Chirp chat will share how you can welcome birds to your garden this spring.
Well, native plants will provide a much more variety of foods than we can do at our feeders. Only a relatively small fraction of birds come to feeders.
All that's coming up on Lake Effect. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Thanks for joining us today. Another state Supreme Court election is on the horizon, and WUWM's Swing State of the Union podcast is back to talk about it. Swing State of the Union is our podcast all about Wisconsin politics. Last season, it explored why Wisconsin Supreme Court elections feel so partisan despite being nonpartisan races. Co-hosts Joy Powers and Sam Woods have released their second of 2 bonus episodes on the court. In this episode, they look at judicial interpretation and the impact it can have on your rights. Here's part of the episode.
In previous episodes, we've talked about how campaign ads rarely depict the reality of what a Supreme Court justice's job is. Some ads focus on how judges have prosecuted criminal defendants, or they focus on hot-button issues, which may or may not be decided by the court. But the Wisconsin Supreme Court is the state's court of last resort, meaning the justices often have the final say on questions over state laws and how to interpret the state's constitution.
So how do we gauge how a judicial candidate will do their job? We do it by understanding their approach to judicial interpretation, which is the process that judges use to understand and explain what a law or provision means. To some, the act of interpreting the law or a constitution is relatively simple. You read what it says and make your determination based on that. That's called textualism, the idea that all of the information needed to understand the law is right there in the text. But that's just one method of interpretation. Jeff Mandel, president and general counsel of the progressive firm Law Forward, explains another common method of interpretation.
One idea has long been to try to figure out what's most fair and consistent with the values of the Constitution, and to recognize that those values and principles will be fairly consistent, but that they will need to, the application of them will need to evolve as our world changes and looks different.
This method is called living constitutionalism, and it's popular among many jurists, including the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Here she is talking about why she believes in the method in 2008 on 60 Minutes.
The genius of the United States is that over now the course of more than 2 centuries, the notion of we the people has become ever larger, so that people who were once left out, like women, like African Americans, like Native Americans, are now part of that we the people. So I see the Constitution as striving for a more perfect union.
Then there's another concept called originalism.
Another principle that we hear a lot about today that was sort of popularized by the late Justice Scalia of the U.S. Supreme Court is the idea of originalism, that what matters for constitutional interpretation is what the people who wrote that provision of the Constitution thought it meant. What did it mean at that moment? And that's what it still means.
Originalism is one of the better-known methods of interpretation. It's often associated with conservatives like the late Justice Antonin Scalia, one of its most ardent champions. Justice Scalia served alongside Justice Ginsburg on the U.S. Supreme Court. During his time there, Scalia made it clear he viewed originalism as the only valid method for interpreting the U.S. Constitution. Here he is at the Hoover Institution in 2012, making that case.
Nowadays, especially with regard to the Constitution, the accepted view, and the view stated by my court repeatedly, is that the words don't necessarily mean what they were understood to mean at the time, but can be given new meaning. It's up to the court to say what they mean today. They mean today what they ought to mean today, and it's up to the court to decide that. That's new, but you know, it all comes under the title, the living Constitution.
The living Constitution. We'll get to that phrase.
Yeah.
But again and again,
I hate it.
You make that clear.
To Scalia, the idea of a living constitution that is intended to meet the needs of an evolving society is not acceptable. Instead, he thought the Constitution should be interpreted based only on what was written in it. But the originalist approach also comes with a set of social mores that can be difficult to square with modern sensibilities, as Mendel demonstrates.
If you think about, for example, the federal Constitution has an amendment that protects all of us from cruel and unusual punishment. This is one that you can see the differences between an originalist approach and a living constitutionalist approach very clearly. Because what we understand as cruel and unusual today is very, very different than what our forebears thought was cruel and unusual in the 1790s when this was written and ratified. And what Justice Scalia or Justice Thomas or some other, strict originalists would say is, if it was not understood as cruel and unusual in the 1790s, then it's not cruel and unusual today. And so there's nothing wrong with public hangings as a criminal punishment, or all kinds of other things that we, in today's day and age, might be fairly squeamish about.
Originalism and textualism can be appealing to judges because they offer a clear roadmap forward, and consistency is an important and necessary part of law. But they can also anchor the law to a bygone era, as Marquette Law School professor Chad Oldfather explains.
There are all sorts of other things you want to think about, right? You want to think about what are the words? What do these words mean? What's their history? You want to think about those larger context clues, right? What's the nature of this government that this Constitution brought into being? What purposes is it trying to achieve, right? What inferences can we draw from this structure? What are the consequences of interpreting it in a particular way? What are past decisions that this court has made about what that provision means? So those sorts of things all have historically mattered in interpretation.
To some originalists, like the late Justice Scalia, methodologies that stray from originalism are heresy. They argue that other methods of interpretation allow judges to find any rationale to support their predetermined conclusion.
But as we've explored in previous episodes, we already place a lot of trust in judges to, use their best judgment.
The accusation that an originalist will make is, that just allows a judge to do whatever they want. My view is that's only if you assume the judge is acting in bad faith. And my response is a judge acting in bad faith is going to be able to manipulate whatever methodology they want. It's a language game at that point, and anyone can play it. A judge acting in good faith, a judge acting with the integrity and the impartiality that we look for, is going to be disciplined, going to have their decision-making channeled by and influenced by all the inputs.
At the Wisconsin Supreme Court, one of its duties is interpreting the state's constitution, a decidedly different document than the U.S. Constitution. Unlike the federal constitution, most state constitutions are more protective of citizens' rights. That distinction is important when it comes to judicial interpretation, because it changes the intent of the document. This focus on rights informs another method of judicial interpretation specific to state law, the democracy principle.
The democracy principle is a shorthand for explaining and describing state constitutions' distinctive and powerful commitment to democracy, and in particular to pillars of popular sovereignty, majority rule, and political equality. We see this principle reflected in extensive text of state constitutions, including provisions that do not appear in the U.S. Constitution, as well as the history and structure of state constitutions. They've really been drafted and amended to prioritize self-rule by popular majorities who participate on equal terms. And so, whereas we can think of the U.S. Constitution as being somewhat skittish about true democracy, trying to avoid it in certain ways, democracy is really a central idea of state constitutions.
That's Miriam Seifter, co-director of the State Democracy Research Initiative at UW-Madison and one of the researchers behind the legal theory of the democracy principle. It's a newer concept that applies to cases that involve issues related to democratic rights, like questions on voting rights, redistricting, or direct democracy. Despite its seemingly narrow focus, interpreting a state's constitution through this framework can have a huge impact on how justices decide on important issues. Since state constitutions are generally more protective of the rights of citizens, that means that something like abortion may not be legally protected at the national level, but it can be at the state level. And that speaks to the true power of a state Supreme Court, granting or denying greater rights to their citizens.
It's just important to recognize that state constitutional law has the ability to shape the lives of people in the state, potentially to protect rights that the federal courts are not currently protecting, and that the judges we elect might be, participating in that process in a way that people probably ought to care about.
That was part of a new episode of WUWM's podcast, Swing State of the Union. It's co-hosted by Joy Powers and Sam Woods. Listen to the full episode to hear from the candidates for Wisconsin's upcoming Supreme Court election. Find both bonus episodes wherever you get your podcasts, download and subscribe, and stay tuned for a full season this fall. Just like Swing State of the Union, Lake Effect is also available as a podcast, so you can listen whenever you like. Find it wherever you get your podcasts, then subscribe, download, and listen on demand. In about 15 minutes, we'll bring you a new Chirp chat that'll help you plan a bird-friendly garden this spring. But first, we'll speak with Renaissance Theaterworks co-founder Susan Fate about her work as she gets ready to retire after more than 30 years with the company. That's coming up next on Lake Effect on Milwaukee's NPR. You're listening to Lake Effect on Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. In 1993, 5 women decided to start and run Renaissance Theaterworks after recognizing the clear inequities professionals like them faced on stage and off. One of those women was Susan Fate. For more than 3 decades, Renaissance has championed women's stories and careers and worked towards gender parity. Co-founder Susan Fate has led the company as artistic director through over 200 productions and readings while fostering opportunities for women theater professionals. She'll be retiring this spring after directing one last show, Barefoot in the Park. Susan joins me now to talk about her career and Renaissance Theaterworks' legacy. She begins by explaining how it all came together 33 years ago.
We all met actually through Michael Wright, who used to be the artistic director at Chamber Theater. In 1993, he was teaching an acting class out of Next Act Theater. And I lived in Milwaukee for about 3 years at that time. And I was working as an actor, doing a little directing. And myself and Raylene and the other ladies started to realize there were fewer opportunities for women in theater, and I had applied to grad school. And at the time, there was a graduate program from UWM, and out of 16 potential slots, they only took 2 women. And their response was, well, we do mostly Shakespeare and other restoration comedies and things like that where there aren't that many women's roles. And I thought, well, you could do other plays, but, And so out of those realizations, like I said, this was not a new fact. It was just, new to us. We were in our late 20s, early 30s. And right around that time, Theater X, which was a very prestigious theater in town, they launched a new series that was Theater X Presents Theater's Women. So it was really great because it forced us to stop just sitting around Marie's kitchen table talking about it and okay, we've got this opportunity. It's coming up in October. Let's try to get something off the ground. And at the same time, I discovered I was pregnant. So by the time we produced A Different Moon, which was by Ira Watson, which was the first show that we produced. Jennifer was a stage manager. I directed. Marie and Raylene were both in it. And Michelle Traban, who's a brilliant theater administrator. She works now at APT. She's the one that created our first budget and was like, okay, we need a timeline. And God bless her, because we'd probably still be there. So by the time we opened that show, I was really pregnant. And so I tend to think of Renaissance and our son Matthew kind of along the same lines, So that's how it started. And we didn't know each other very well, but we became lifelong friends, and the other four women have gone their own ways. Marie continues to write plays and has been very successful. Jennifer she writes novels and is very successful. Raylene is a tenured teacher at UWM, and as I said, Michelle's at APT. And I'm still here. They abandoned me, and I'm not over it.
Stuck it out.
Yeah.
Well, and you said Theater X kind of had this offshoot programming. And then you guys come in to be like, okay, we're going to establish a company that is dedicated to this. And, as you said, it was nothing new, but it was the time to make some action. But I imagine nothing was as largely organized as Renaissance at that time, right? Just those offshoot programmings.
Yeah.
How do we compare to other states or even a broader scale than that?
In terms of gender equity?
Yeah, in your mission, and then you were looking hey, who else is doing this? Did you have connections or networks?
We didn't. And sometimes I really think you're better off not knowing how big of a hurdle you're going to, because you wouldn't do it. We didn't. And Renaissance is the second oldest theater company in the nation dedicated to gender equity. So it was a new idea at the time. I'd love to say it was embraced warmly by the community, but some of the first things we heard was, well, does this mean you're going to exclude men and other things that were not so polite? But we were dedicated to providing opportunities to women on stage and off and people that identify as women, and always remaining debt-free. In 33 years, we have never been in debt. So we started small with the one production that we were able to do because of Theater X, and then we did a staged reading of Marie's first play, and then we proceeded in that way. We all had, I'm also a registered nurse, so I was still working part-time as a nurse, and I had an infant at home, and Maria's a writer and dramaturg, and Jennifer and her husband ran Comedy Sports, owned and operated Comedy Sports. Michelle had a full-time job at UWM, as did Raylene. So we did what we could with what we had, and little by little, we grew slowly, but I think wisely, for the most part, at least. And we had hired a part-time office help in the mid-'90s, and then we hired Julie Swenson, who's now at Forward Theater in Madison, to be our first full-time employee. She was our producing director for almost 17 years. So we hired her about 8 years into Renaissance.
Well, and I want to talk about kind of that approach of growing slowly but carefully. And with the history of Renaissance Theaterworks, but also just the challenges that are present for any arts production companies, right?
Yeah.
And in your tenure, there's been so many also big challenges like recession and COVID, to name two massive ones. What do you think is the key to resilience when it comes to Renaissance and how you guys have operated?
I don't know. I've thought about it a lot. I think we're all very close. I think that helps. While we all have our own areas of expertise, it's rather fluid, and that there's nothing that any of us wouldn't do if it was necessary for the company. You know, I'm not a scenic painter, but boy, if something needed painting and there was no one to do it, I'd be the first person there with a brush. So I think that helps. I think having realistic expectations and wanting it so much and just trying to figure it out.
So over the past 33 years, X amount of productions, right? I want to talk a little bit about the impact of Renaissance Theaterworks' mission of greater gender equity in theater. Can you share some of the quantitative and qualitative results that you've kept track of over the years?
One of the things that I'm really proud of are the opportunities that we've given, first-time opportunities to different local professionals. We have persuaded several women actors to become directors. We gave Laura Gordon and Angela Iannone and Mary Kerr their first professional directing opportunities. And they've now gone on to direct all over the country. And I'm really proud of that. You know, it's unfortunate. It's still a fact that as a successful actor, you get to be, as a woman, you get to be about 50, 55 in all the roles. Are dry up. So Laura told me not that long ago, she said, if I hadn't started directing, I don't know that I'd still be in the business. Mm-hmm. And she's supremely talented, you know. And she certainly still gets work. There's just not as many roles. So I'm really proud of that. I mean, they had the talent and the ability, but we provided a place where they could safely fail if they needed to, you know, and we've had little of that, but you have to be willing to fail in order to move forward.
You're talking about creating safe spaces for people to fail, pulling the people behind you, pushing them up towards the front, fostering so many connections. And I imagine that's a lot of what it takes to be successful for such a long time is those connections. Do you have a personal mission or way you go about connecting with others in a meaningful way?
I don't. It's never been part of a plan as much as, you know, you meet people who are eager to learn more and that you see incredible talent and all they need is a chance to get to try out their skills. And if you can help them and reassure them and get them over a few bumpy spots, they excel. And I know mentors are important, but I do think that most of the people that I've had the privilege of working with would have been just great without me. I just happen to know that it's like, well, you're spectacular and the world will see it. I just happen to be in the room right now, you know. But it's so much fun. It's a wonderful experience to get to help somebody try something new for the first time. You just help point people in the right direction, and it's really fun.
I know this is probably a hard question, so I'm just going to ask you to say whatever's on the top of your mind. Okay. You've touched so many theater artists in your tenure. What do you feel most proud of in this moment as your career with Renaissance is coming to the end of its chapter?
I feel most proud that we've stayed true to our mission. And the thing that's the most important about Renaissance are the people. And the people on our staff are the finest individuals I've ever known or ever worked with. And I'm incredibly proud of the way we treat everyone as though they're a guest in our home. And that's our mission, and that's what we try to do.
It's a beautiful mission. Very important. You're closing out your career with RTW directing Barefoot in the Park.
Yes.
Was this a show you knew you wanted to personally end on, or was it just happy accident that it lined up this way?
I've wanted to do Barefoot in the Park for a long, long time. I think it's a perfect comedy. I love Neil Simon. I think he's a genius. There was a period of time where I was afraid it was too dated. It's a piece of its time. You know, the main character, Corey, Neil Simon wrote as a homage to his wife, his first wife, who he adored and who was a passionate free spirit. And he wrote plays, I read this in his autobiography, character first. And so he wanted to write a play that was reflective of his wife, Joan. It was written in 1963. she didn't have a job. It was never discussed that she would have a job. Now, that's not realistic today. The couple also, this is before people routinely lived together. Much like in his own marriage, they met, had a whirlwind courtship, had a 7-day honeymoon, and moved in together. Now, that's not realistic today, but boy, it makes for some great comedy, because all of a sudden you have this couple that's hugely in love, but has never stayed under the same roof. So it's hilarious. He chose characters that he loved and then found many obstacles to put in their way. He wrote in his biography that I really loved. He said, the first scene shows us how much Corey and Paul love each other, which is really good because for the rest of the play, they don't act very nice to each other.
So lots of fun for a director like yourself.
Very fun.
This whole time we've been talking about your legacy with RTW. What do you hope to see from them moving forward and cheering them on?
Oh, I have no doubt that they will continue to do brilliant work that will surpass anything that we have done thus far. And they're special, incredibly talented people. And I know that they will go on to heights yet unseen.
What are you looking forward to in this next phase for you?
Oh, gosh. I'm looking forward to spending more time with my husband. It's a wonderful job, and I've loved every minute of it, but it's intense and long. My husband's been retired for the last 2 years, so he's been pretty patient. My family is mostly in Chicago, so I look forward to seeing them more and maybe taking a few more trips.
Well, I wish you all the best after Barefoot in the Park wraps for you. And Susan, thank you so much for joining me today and for all the work in the community you've done.
Thank you so much.
Susan Fate is one of the co-founders and the artistic director of Renaissance Theaterworks. She'll be retiring after directing Barefoot in the Park, which runs through April 12th. You can find more information at wuwm.com. We'll take one more break, and when we return, we'll learn about the different ways you can attract birds to your garden this spring. Keep listening to Lake Effect on WUWM. This is Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. You don't need to travel far to see stunning birds. In fact, they're often right in our backyards. But if you want to welcome more feathered friends to your yard, it's important to think beyond bird feeders. Mariette Nowak is an ecologist and the author of Birdscaping for Wisconsin and the Great Lakes region. Birdscaping is just landscaping with birds in mind. And Nowak says growing native plants can create a year-round bird sanctuary. She joins Lake Effect's Excret Nunez to share how people can create a pocket of paradise for birds this spring.
For this episode of Chirp Chat, I wanted to learn how people can get their gardens ready to welcome birds this spring and summer. And a lot of people think that putting up bird feeders is a way to attract birds to their gardens. But you explain in your book that native plants are the best way to attract them. So why are native plants good for birds?
Well, native plants will provide a much more variety of foods than we can do at our feeders. And native plants have evolved with birds through centuries and centuries, and they produce just the right kind of food at the right time of year for birds and the right nutrition. So evolving through the years, Mother Nature has perfected things.
So would you say that birds would rather come to plants than a bird feeder?
Well, they like both. I have feeders too. I love to have feeders, especially in the winter when there's not as many plants and fruits and seeds available in your garden. So I like that too. And sometimes birds find it easier to get some seeds, but there's birds that don't eat seeds. Only really a relatively small fraction of birds come to feeders. And a lot of birds eat a lot of fruit, which we usually don't put in our feeders, and they'll eat insects in particular. Especially baby birds need insects to have the protein that they need to grow up and become adult birds. Especially caterpillars, they're juicy, they're full of protein for baby birds. And almost all, about 90% of land birds really need caterpillars and other insects to feed their young.
So, before people go out and start getting their hands dirty, what do you recommend as the first step in getting a garden ready for birds?
The first step would really be to prepare the soil that you're going to plant them in. Taking out all the plants that are there, having bare ground is really best. And of course, it's particularly important to get rid of invasive plants, which tend to take over and will really wipe out any planting that you do if you don't take them out.
And I do have a question about invasive plants, but before I get to that, you mentioned in the book that people should stick to planting true native plants rather than nativars. What's the difference between the both?
Well, a native plant is like, sometimes we say straight native plants. They're the way they evolve, they're natural. But horticulturists often like to take those native plants and add or detract things to make them, in their view, better. And sometimes it's not the worst idea. But what happens is that if they change one thing in the plant, for example, the color, they might lose the ability of the plant to produce seed. Or if they have too many petals, the extra petals were where the pollen and nectar was, and the plants lose that. So oftentimes, but not always, I have to admit, but oftentimes nativars lose their best value for plants. They have less nectar, maybe no nectar, no seeds. And there's so many plants, it's hard to study them all and make sure. So that's why it's just easier and more practical and better for birds to stick to straight native plants.
And you do cover, I believe, over 50 native plants that can attract birds in your book. But what are some of those invasive plants that you mentioned that people should keep an eye out for and remove when prepping their garden?
Well, there are three big ones, but there's lots of others too. But that would be buckthorn, honeysuckle. Those are both shrubs. And then an herbaceous plant called garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is an herbaceous plant, and it can take over and wipe out the good and native plants that are in the understory. It can be quite aggressive. It's very easy to pull out, but it can be brought in by animals too, even after you take it out. But once you get it out, it does reduce in numbers quite a bit. And then buckthorn and honeysuckle are shrubs, and they do have berries, but the berries aren't of best value for birds. Buckthorn the berries will give the birds diarrhea, and the honeysuckle has berries. Since they're so invasive, that would be the only berry available for the birds, and they wouldn't get the variety of other berries that had different nutritional value for the birds. And it can also take over woodlands and reduce the growth of trees. Usually the best way is to cut them down and just put a little dash of herbicide on their trunks so they don't regrow.
Well, I'm glad we mentioned those so people can keep an eye out for them. And we're getting away from this, well, hopefully, we're getting away from this pretty unpredictable weather so far this year. But what are some beginner-friendly plants you recommend people start planning around this time of year, around spring?
Yes, I know we do have crazy weather, but there are some plants that are pretty hardy. Black-eyed Susans are so popular and lovely. They're pretty hardy. Purple coneflower is a good one. Wild bergamot. Those are some of the beautiful ones that I think would be pretty hardy in most cases. First of all, they would attract insects while they're growing. And then in addition, they'll have seeds galore for the birds that are seed eaters. So there's value throughout the year with the insects, the seeds, and so forth.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to go ahead and reintroduce us. I'm Lake Effect's Xcaret Nunez, speaking with Mariette Nowak, author of Birdscaping for Wisconsin and the Great Lakes region, about how to attract birds to your garden. So, Mariette, your book focuses on 5 groups of land birds: hummingbirds, prairie birds, savanna birds, shrubland birds, and woodland birds. Why did you decide to organize the book this way?
I like to organize it in the kind of the habitat birds need. Often the similar group of birds need similar habitat. And by having a whole group of birds, you can offer tips on how birds in that group might need the type of food that you're offering. For example, shrubland birds usually like a lot of fruit. And so you want shrubs that produce fruit, whereas hummingbirds like flowers that produce nectar. So you want to concentrate on those kinds of flowers. So it's good to offer the birds the habitat with which they have evolved and prefer.
Well, someone listening to our conversation might be a renter like myself. I'm not a homeowner. Someone might just have access to a porch or a balcony. Is it possible to create a small pocket of prairie for birds when you have no yard?
Oh, definitely. A lot of people do that. One good way to do it is to get some big 5-gallon jug, make sure there's drainage, put a few rocks and then potting soil in, and then put in 3 to 5 plants. When you choose plants, either for a larger garden or for a porch prairie, try to have a plant or plants that will blossom throughout the year, like spring, summer, and fall. And for example, for sunny porch prairie, you could have kind of a silky aster, which is a small aster, a type of coreopsis that's smaller, and butterfly weed, and those would blossom and provide color and insects throughout the season. You could put in a few grasses too, such as prairie dropseed or little blue stem. Those are short grasses that would prop up those plants. But if you have a shady porch, you could use wild geranium and columbine and zigzag goldenrod, for example, which would be plants that would blossom and produce insects and seeds through the season. That's great because you'd have more of a continual native plant scene for birds. Some people would have yards to the porches and another yard and so forth. The best idea is to have a continuous native plant offering for the birds throughout neighborhoods.
I have personally never heard of a porch prairie or a pocket prairie before, so that's really interesting. And a theme that keeps coming up from our conversation that I've noticed is that why is it important to have a diverse number of plants?
First of all, if it's a droughty, dry year, some plants do better than in a very wet year. And we've had both, right? We've had some droughty years in the past and then flooding in other times. So it's really good to have that variety for that reason. But also, you have more variety for the birds, and it's better for them to have a variety of offerings and nutrition. So all kinds of good reasons to try to have variety. And they believe that if you have a better diversity, your native garden would be more stable and long lasting. And one kind of good thing about a porch prairie is that you can water them regularly if they need it. Whereas if you have a stand of prairie off rather far away, it's harder to keep them watered. And it's especially important to water them when you first plant them, months in year, to make sure they're well established and get their roots down.
I want to bring up that one of the most exciting parts of spring migration is seeing ruby-throated hummingbirds. I think of them as the jewels of Wisconsin. What are some native plants that will attract them to people's gardens?
Well, some rather easy ones to grow are wild columbine and then wild bergamot, and then actually a little shrub. Pussy willow is really good for the birds too. They have a lot of small insects for hummingbirds. Hummingbirds, while most of their food is nectar, they do depend on insects, just like most birds. So pussy willow would provide those insects, whereas the other two, and a variety of other plants too, would provide the nectar.
Well, Mariette, we've reached the end of Chirp Chat. But before we wrap up, I always love to ask guests to shine a spotlight on a bird for the month. And I was wondering, what's a bird you'd like to highlight this month?
I would like to highlight the eastern bluebird. Bluebirds are so gorgeous, and they usually come kind of in mass as they're migrating at this time of year, about mid-March. We've already, I think most people might have seen robins already and some of the blackbirds, the red-winged blackbirds. But now's the time for the bluebirds. They have the sky on their back, that beautiful, stunning blue, and they have the earth on their breast because they're orange breast. So I think that's a great description of them. Sometimes they're called the bird of happiness.
The bird of happiness, is that what you said?
Yes.
Oh, I love that. I remember the very first time I saw an eastern bluebird, and I was in Missouri, and that's Missouri's state bird. I just smiled from ear to ear, and every time I get to see one, it's like a little treat. It makes my day, truly.
Good. Yes, I think everybody feels that way about bluebirds. And they don't come to real small yards, but they'll come to larger yards or parks and so forth, or the countryside. So I hope everybody gets a chance to see a lot of bluebirds this year.
I do too. Well, Mariette, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with me. I'm really excited to create my own pocket of paradise for birds.
Well, thank you. I was delighted to be here.
Mariette Nowak is the author of Birdscaping for Wisconsin and the Great Lakes region. She's also an ecologist and the former director of the Ware Nature Center. Nowak spoke with Lake Effect's Excret Nunez. To learn more birdscaping tips, head on over to WUWM.com. Spring has arrived in Wisconsin, and the days are beginning to warm. Many of us are getting ready to spend more time outdoors, and what better way to enjoy nature than with your dog? But not every trail or park is right for your pup, as author Danielle St. Louis explains in her book, A Dog Lover's Guide to Hiking Wisconsin's State Parks. St. Louis joins Lake Effect's Joy Powers to share what makes a park good for your dog and some of the best locations in the Milwaukee area to take them.
When you're looking at a hiking trail, what makes something good for a dog? What is the criteria that you use?
Some of the criteria that I use when I'm looking at trails and whether they're appropriate for bringing dogs are things like the width of the trail. So it's always a nice thing to have space when you're passing other hikers, especially other hikers who also have dogs. To have room on the trail to step aside and let those people pass by you with ample space. And so if the trail is too narrow or if there are potential hazards, if you need to step off the trail to let other people pass, those are types of things that I like to look for and the types of things that I comment on in the guidebook. I also look at the trail materials. So what is the makeup of the things you're walking on? So is it mostly stone or sand or dirt? Because some dogs have issues with walking on different types of materials. And it's also helpful for planning your own footwear too as a human.
Sure. Now, when we're looking at specifically trails around Wisconsin, I know I've gone outside with my dog and thought, I wonder if you should be sniffing that plant that much. I wonder if you should be looking like, what are you doing there? Is that safe? Are there things that we need to be aware of that tend to be on trails throughout Wisconsin?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely poison ivy in many of our parks and poison oak, and those are plants that you should watch out for and can be more upsetting to you than your dog. But you do need to watch out if your dog gets poison ivy, oils on their fur, and then if you pet your dog, then it transfers to your skin. So those plants would be more upsetting topically to you than your dog. But eating certain plants can be disruptive to your dog's, GI tract and can lead to intestinal upset. So eating plants along the trail is usually something you'd like to avoid. Black walnuts are especially toxic to dogs. And so I do make note in the book about trails that have more black walnut tree populations by them. And then also, any types of animal, whether it's animal droppings or like owl pellets, those types of things also can be problematic for your dog. They can contain bacteria and things that aren't going to be good for your dog and also cause GI upset. So those are the types of things that you want to look out for and try and ensure that your dog doesn't eat while you're walking along the trails.
I think anyone who's familiar with a black walnut tree will know about those big green pods that it lets off. And I could imagine a dog looking at it and thinking, oh, this is a tennis ball. This is something to play with.
Yeah, right. And so ideally you want to avoid using those black walnuts as tennis balls.
So, looking at these hiking trails themselves, when we're looking around the Milwaukee area, what are some of the best trails to bring your dog?
So I specifically paid attention to state parks. So there may be additional state recreation areas in the Milwaukee area, but the three state parks that are closest to the Milwaukee area are Lakeshore State Park, which is actually downtown right by the Summerfest grounds, Kohler Andre State Park, and then Harrington Beach State Park. And so those Harrington Beach and Kohler Andre State Parks are north of Milwaukee along the shoreline there with beautiful dunes and dog beaches. So those are excellent options if you want to head to the beach on a nice summer day and take your dog with you. Lakeshore State Park in Milwaukee is a nice option for just a quick day hike, just to see the lake and the downtown skyline with your dog. It's also a park that doesn't require a park pass or permit, so you can visit for free any day of the year.
Very nice. Now, as we're looking throughout kind of the Milwaukee area and what we might consider day trips from Milwaukee, what are some of your favorite hiking trails?
For a day trip from Milwaukee, you can do Kohler Andre and Harrington Beach both as day trips. And of those two parks, Kohler Andre has more restrictive dog areas. So there's portions of the park where you're not allowed to take your dog. Harrington Beach has fewer dog restrictions, but they both have really nice trails. So Kohler Andre has got a nice area that's specifically meant for dogs and dog hiking, and it's through some really beautiful pine stands. So that's a favorite. And then Harrington Beach around the Quarry Lake is a beautiful little short mile hike that just takes you around the quarry that's filled in with water. It's a very crystal blue kind of little lake and a nice experience for walking with your dog. So those are both two options in the day trip from Milwaukee category that are really pleasant options.
Now, you mentioned restrictions. Some of these parks do have restrictions, and there are a variety of reasons why you might. What are some of the reasons that we should really adhere to the restrictions that are in place in especially state parks that might be areas for other animals?
So the restrictions regarding dogs in our state parks are generally the main rule of thumb, or the general restriction is that your dog needs to be on a leash at all times when you're in a state park. And that is a rule for many reasons. It's a great way to keep your dog from disturbing any animals that are in the area. I know there are a lot of populations of animals that we're trying to, be good stewards of those in their environments. And so keeping our dogs away from those animals and from disturbing them. So keeping them on leash so that they don't disturb them. And also so they're not causing additional erosion in areas that we're also trying to reestablish or maintain. So for example, the dunes environments at Kohler Andre State Park, it's a very sensitive environment. And so there are restrictions about taking your dog on certain parts of the boardwalk because of the potential impact of your dog being on the dune. So keeping your dog on leash is a primary restriction, but for great reasons in terms of being good stewards of and respecting the environment around us, and also respecting our fellow park visitors. As dog lovers, we tend to assume all people love dogs, but that actually isn't the case. And so it's just the best way to be respectful visitors is to keep your dog on leash and not in other people's space so that they can also enjoy the park in their own way.
For sure. Now, looking at all of Wisconsin, there are going to be a lot of people who are traveling to different parts of the state, whether they're going home or whether they're on vacation. Where are some good places to hike throughout the state? Some of your favorites?
Sure. There are so many beautiful places in Wisconsin, which is something I discovered through researching and writing the book. Some of my favorites. So in the Door County area, there are parks that are super popular. So Peninsula State Park is a very popular park, and it is beautiful, but I like to visit parks that are a little less crowded. And so my recommendation for the Door County area is Potawatomi State Park, which has a lot of the same features as Peninsula, or Newport State Park, which is also beautiful along the great beaches for your dogs as well at Newport. In the Madison area, Devil's Lake, again, is a really popular park. It's beautiful, but it's so popular that I tend to go to Mirror Lake State Park instead, which is just a little bit further away and is also very beautiful. Again, some of the same features as Devil's Lake, but just typically fewer people. So Mirror Lake is beautiful. Also on the western side of the state, southwestern, Wyalusing State Park and Nelson Dewey are some of my favorites, very beautiful. In northwestern, there's Interstate State Park, which is great. And even further up is Willow River, which is beautiful right outside of Hudson, some amazing waterfalls. So there's a lot of amazing natural features in our state that are the jewels of our state parks.
A lot of great places to check out, and if you check out the book, you will find a lot more information about each of these spaces and how you can interact with them with your dogs. Danielle, thank you so much for joining us here on Lake Effect and sharing your work.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Danielle St. Louis is the author of A Dog Lover's Guide to Hiking Wisconsin State Parks. She spoke with Lake Effect's Joy Powers in 2022. And that wraps up Lake Effect for today. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. If you've missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at wuwm.com. If you'd like to take the show on the go, you can download the Lake Effect podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Tomorrow on Lake Effect, we'll highlight some of our favorite conversations from the week, including a look at a new photo book that highlights Milwaukee's music scene. Thank you so much for joining us today, right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.